Welcome, weary traveler of the modern world. Tonight, we journey backward through the mists of time to an era when the simple act of chewing your evening meal carried risks we can scarcely imagine today. Settle yourself comfortably in your bed, perhaps adjusting your pillow just so, and allow your mind to drift with me to the medieval world, a place where the loss of a single tooth could reshape not just a smile, but an entire life. In the flickering candlelight of centuries past, when the rhythm of daily existence moved to the steady beat of church bells and the turning of seasons, the human mouth held secrets and suffering that we, in our age of fluoride and dental floss, have largely forgotten. Tonight, we explore what it truly meant to lose a tooth in the Middle Ages. Not merely the physical pain, though that was considerable, but the cascade of consequences that rippled through every aspect of medieval existence. Imagine yourself settling into this journey as you might sink into a warm bath after a long day. Let the concerns of your contemporary life fade like smoke from a dying hearth, and prepare to inhabit a world where the simple luxury of biting into an apple without worry was reserved for the young and fortunate. Close your eyes if you wish, and let your breathing slow to match the gentle pace of our exploration through time. Picture yourself awakening in a medieval village as the first pale light of dawn seeps through the gaps in wooden shutters. The air carries the crisp bite of early morning, thick with the mingled scents of wood smoke drifting from banked hearth fires, damp earth from the night's gentle rain, and the faint sweetness of hay from nearby stables where horses shift quietly in their stalls. You lie for a moment on your straw-filled mattress, the coarse fabric of your rough linen shift slightly damp from the cool morning air, wrapped in woolen blankets that smell of the sheep they came from and the herbs, lavender, rosemary, mint, that were scattered among them to ward off insects and unpleasant odors. As consciousness fully returns to your medieval body, you become aware of sensations that would be foreign to modern experience. Your muscles ache from the previous day's labor. Perhaps you spent long hours bent over in the fields, harvesting barley under the late summer sun. Or maybe you worked at the spinning wheel, your fingers growing numb from the repetitive motions of drawing out thread from carded wool. But beyond these familiar aches lies another sensation, one that has become as constant as your own heartbeat. A persistent, dull throb from somewhere deep within your jaw, a reminder that your teeth, those precious tools of survival, are engaged in a slow but relentless battle against time, diet, and the grinding necessities of daily life. This morning ache in your jaw is not the sharp, urgent pain that might drive you to seek immediate relief, but rather the chronic discomfort that has become woven into the fabric of your daily existence. It speaks of teeth that have been worn down by years of chewing coarse bread filled with bits of stone from the grinding wheels, of molars that have cracked under the pressure of breaking nuts with no other tools available, of incisors that have been chipped by the countless small accidents that mark a life lived close to the edge of subsistence. Imagine yourself rising slowly from your bed, feeling the familiar protest of joints that have never known the luxury of sleeping on a soft mattress designed to support the spine's natural curves. Your bare feet touch the packed earth floor of your cottage, cold and slightly damp despite the dried rushes scattered across its surface. The rushes release their herbal fragrance as you step on them. Meadowsweet, mint, and thyme gathered from the surrounding countryside and laid down fresh just yesterday by your wife or daughter. One of the small rituals that make the harsh reality of medieval life more bearable. The wooden bowl beside your sleeping place contains water drawn the previous evening from the village well. Not the crystal clear, chemically treated liquid we take for granted, but water that carries with it the subtle flavors of earth and stone, perhaps tinged with the faint taste of iron from the metal bucket used to draw it up from the depths. This water has sat overnight in the wooden bowl, and its surface shows the delicate film that forms when organic matter settles, a reminder that every drop of liquid consumed in medieval times carried with it the potential for both nourishment and harm. You cup this water in your hands, feeling its coolness against your palms, and bring it to your lips for the morning ritual of cleansing your mouth. As the water swirls around your teeth and gums, you become acutely aware of each individual tooth, cataloging their condition with the unconscious thoroughness of someone whose survival depends on these 32 small tools functioning properly. This upper left molar feels solid and strong. That lower right bicuspid has a sharp edge that sometimes catches your tongue. This front tooth wiggles ever so slightly when you probe it with your tongue. Not enough to cause alarm, but enough to register as a change from last week's assessment. The ritual of morning mouth cleansing in medieval times bore little resemblance to our modern dental hygiene routines. There was no mint-fresh toothpaste designed by scientists to fight plaque and gingivitis. No soft-bristled brush engineered to reach every crevice between teeth without damaging delicate gum tissue. Instead, you might run a rough cloth over your teeth and gums, the coarse weave of the fabric providing some mechanical cleaning action while simultaneously irritating tissues that were already tender from poor nutrition and constant use. If you were among the more fortunate peasants, you might possess a small twig cut from a birch or oak tree, its end carefully frayed by chewing until it formed a primitive brush. This twig, when rubbed against the teeth, provided both mechanical cleaning and the mild antiseptic properties of the tree's natural compounds. The taste was earthy and slightly bitter, nothing like the refreshing mint or cinnamon flavors that make modern toothbrushing a pleasant experience. But it served its purpose in removing some of the food particles and bacterial film that accumulated overnight. Some medieval people knew to choose certain herbs for their dental benefits. Mint for its clean taste and mild antiseptic properties, sage for its ability to tighten gums and reduce inflammation, or fennel seeds that freshen breath while providing gentle abrasive action. These herbs, when available, were precious not just for their dental benefits, but for their ability to mask the unpleasant tastes and odors that were constant companions in an age before effective dental care. The act of eating breakfast in medieval times revealed the daily challenge faced by every person of that era, regardless of their social station. Your morning meal might consist of dark, coarse bread, dense and chewy, made from whatever grains were available in your region and economic circumstances. If you were fortunate enough to live in an area where wheat grew well and your lord was not too demanding in his collection of grain rents, your bread might be made primarily from wheat flour, though it would still contain a significant portion of chaff, small pieces of grain husk, and the inevitable grit that found its way into flour during the grinding process. More likely, your bread was made from a mixture of grains, barley, oats, rye, perhaps even peas or beans ground fine when grain was scarce. This bread was not the light, airy product we know today, but a dense, heavy food that required serious effort to chew. The crust, baked hard to preserve the bread for as long as possible, could be tough enough to challenge even healthy teeth, while the interior, though softer, had a coarse texture that contained bits and pieces that could surprise an unwary chewer. Imagine the sensation of biting into this bread, feeling the resistance against your teeth as you work to tear off a piece small enough to chew safely. Your jaw muscles, already accustomed to this daily workout, engage with the steady rhythm that has become second nature. But with each bite, you remain alert to the dangers. A piece of stone from the grinding wheel that could crack a tooth, a bit of unwound grain hard enough to cause damage, or simply the cumulative effect of the bread's abrasive texture wearing away at tooth enamel that has no chance to repair itself through modern dental interventions. The medieval diet included textures and challenges that would seem almost foreign to our modern palate. If you were fortunate enough to afford it, you might add a small piece of hard cheese to your morning meal, its salty richness a welcome contrast to the bland bread. But this cheese, aged without refrigeration in conditions that were far from ideal, often developed a texture that was nearly rock hard, requiring patient gnawing and careful positioning in the mouth to avoid placing too much stress on teeth that were already compromised by years of similar challenges. For those living in the countryside, wild foods supplemented the diet in ways that added both nutrition and risk to every meal. Imagine yourself gathering hazelnuts from the forest floor on a crisp autumn morning, the shells still damp with dew and scattered among the fallen leaves that crunch underfoot. These nuts, while providing valuable protein and oils that were often scarce in the peasant diet, came with shells so hard that cracking them required using your back teeth as nature's own nutcracker, applying pressure that sent stress waves through the entire tooth structure. The satisfying crack as the shell finally gives way, followed by the rich, oily meat of the nut, made the risk seem worthwhile, until the inevitable day when a shell proved harder than expected, or when your attention wandered for just a moment, and you felt rather than heard the small, sharp crack of something more precious than nutshell giving way. That moment of realization, when your tongue immediately seeks out the source of the sensation and finds the rough edge of a newly damaged tooth, marks the beginning of another chapter in the slow decline that every medieval person understood as the natural course of life. The morning hours of medieval life were filled with activities that placed constant demands on teeth and jaws in ways that we rarely consider today. If you were a woman, your morning tasks might include preparing food for your family's meals throughout the day, work that required using your teeth as tools in addition to their primary function of eating. Cracking nuts, as we have seen, was a regular necessity, but you might also use your teeth to hold small objects while your hands were busy with other tasks, or to break tough fibers when preparing plant materials for various household uses. Men's work often involved different but equally demanding uses for teeth. A carpenter might hold small nails between his teeth while working, the metal gradually wearing grooves in the tooth enamel that served as a sort of professional signature visible to anyone who knew how to read the signs. A rope maker would draw rough hemp fibers across his front teeth to separate and soften them, slowly filing away at the tooth surfaces until they developed the characteristic notches that marked his trade. Picture yourself at the village well as the morning progresses, the sun now high enough to burn off the last wisps of mist that clung to the low places during the early hours. The well serves as the social center of the village, a place where news is shared, gossip exchanged, and the subtle hierarchies of rural life played out in countless small interactions. As you work the heavy wooden windlass to draw up the leather bucket, your muscles straining against the weight of water that seems to grow heavier with each passing year, you have the opportunity to observe your neighbors and fellow villagers. Notice how many of them speak with subtle changes in pronunciation, slight lisps, or alterations in the way they form certain words, telltale signs of missing or damaged teeth that have forced them to adapt their speech patterns. Watch how they eat when food is shared at community gatherings, the way some favor one side of their mouth over the other, or how they carefully cut food into smaller pieces before attempting to chew it. These adaptations have become so natural, so integrated into their daily routines, that they barely think about them anymore. But to an observant eye, they tell the story of a community where dental loss is not an exception, but an expected part of aging. The social dynamics around the well also reveal the ways that dental problems affected relationships and social standing in medieval communities. A young woman whose smile has been marred by the loss of front teeth might find her marriage prospects diminished, not because she is any less capable of being a good wife, but because physical appearance played a role in the practical arrangements that governed medieval marriages. An older man whose dental problems have progressed to the point where he can no longer eat certain foods might find himself subtly excluded from certain social gatherings, or might need to rely more heavily on family members for food preparation, shifting the balance of dependence and authority within his household. Yet the medieval community also developed ways of accommodating and supporting those whose dental problems had progressed beyond the manageable stage. Watch the interactions around the well carefully, and you might notice how certain villagers are automatically given the softer portions of any shared food, or how others instinctively speak a bit more slowly and clearly when addressing someone whose hearing might be affected by dental problems that have spread to cause broader health issues. The afternoon brings its own dental challenges as the day's work reaches its peak intensity. If you're working in the fields, the physical exertion of harvesting grain or digging root vegetables often leads to unconscious teeth grinding, a stress response that slowly but surely wears down the chewing surfaces of molars and premolars. The dust raised by agricultural work settles in your mouth, mixing with saliva to form a gritty paste that acts like sandpaper against tooth enamel with every swallow. Picture yourself bent over in a field of barley, the grain heavy and ready for harvest, your back aching from hours of cutting stalks with a sharp sickle. The repetitive motion of swinging the blade, gathering the cut grain, and binding it into sheaves creates a rhythm that extends throughout your body, including your jaw muscles, which clench and release in time with your work. This unconscious grinding slowly files away at your teeth, but it also serves as a release valve for the physical stress of demanding labor, a trade-off between immediate comfort and long-term dental health that medieval people made without fully understanding the consequences. The evening meal brings perhaps the greatest daily challenge to medieval teeth. As the sun begins to set and the day's work finally comes to an end, families gather around their hearth for the main meal of the day. If you're fortunate enough to have meat, it comes from animals that lived harder lives than their modern counterparts. Cattle that grazed on rough pasture, sheep that foraged for themselves on hillsides, pigs that rooted for food in forests and waste areas. The meat from these animals was tough, sinewy, and required patient gnawing and tearing that placed enormous stress on teeth and jaw joints. Imagine the methodical process of eating a piece of salt-preserved pork, the meat tough from the preservation process, and stringy from the animal's active life. You must work your way around gristly bits, using your front teeth to strip meat from small bones, your molars to grind the tougher portions into pieces small enough to swallow safely. Every bite requires attention and care, always aware that one wrong move, one hidden splinter of bone or bit of gristle tougher than expected, could spell disaster for a tooth that has already been weakened by years of similar challenges. The vegetables that accompanied medieval meals, while softer than meat, brought their own challenges. Root vegetables like turnips and parsnips, stored through the winter months in conditions that were far from ideal, often developed tough, woody textures that required considerable effort to chew. Dried legumes, peas, beans, lentils, provided essential protein, but had to be cooked for hours to reach a texture that was manageable for compromised teeth. Even when properly prepared, these foods often contain small stones or other debris that have found its way into the pot during harvesting or storage. As you settle in for the night, perhaps mending clothes by the dim light of a tallow candle that fills the air with its smoky, animal smell, your mind might turn to the inventory that has become as natural as breathing. The systematic assessment of each tooth's condition and reliability. Your tongue, that most sensitive of instruments, makes its rounds, probing gently at teeth that have shown signs of weakness, testing the firmness of those that have seemed solid, noting new sensitivities or changes in texture that might signal the beginning of new problems. This nightly ritual of dental self-examination was perhaps one of the most intimate and private acts of medieval life, more personal than prayer, more revealing than any conversation. Unlike the grand concerns that occupied the minds of scholars and nobles, theological debates, political maneuvering, the rise and fall of kingdoms, the health of one's teeth was an immediate, unavoidable reality that touched every moment of every day. Tonight, as you lie on your straw mattress listening to the sounds of the village settling into sleep, the distant lowing of cattle in their byres, the rustle of thatch in the evening breeze, the murmur of voices from neighboring cottages where families share their own quiet conversations, your tongue finds that troublesome molar that has been causing concern for the past several weeks. The slight looseness you detected last month has progressed, and you can now move the tooth just perceptibly with gentle pressure from your tongue. This discovery fills you not with sharp panic, but with the quiet resignation of someone who has always known that this moment would come. You have watched your parents, your older siblings, your neighbors undergo this same gradual process of dental decline. You have seen how they adapted, how they learned new ways of eating and speaking, how they found dignity and purpose even as their bodies changed in ways that could not be reversed or prevented. The process of losing a tooth in medieval times was rarely sudden or dramatic. Unlike a broken bone or a cut that heals, dental problems progress slowly, giving their victims time to adapt and adjust. First came the awareness of weakness, a slight sensitivity to hot or cold liquids, a tendency to favor the other side of the mouth when chewing tough foods, a reluctance to bite directly into hard objects that once posed no challenge. Then began the period of careful management, the unconscious strategies that developed to protect the weakening tooth while maintaining as much normal function as possible. You learn to chew more slowly, to cut food into smaller pieces, to avoid the hardest crusts of bread and the toughest bits of meat. You developed new ways of speaking that minimized the stress on sensitive teeth, subtle changes in pronunciation that allowed you to communicate clearly while protecting damaged areas. During this phase, which might last months or even years, the affected tooth became a constant presence in your consciousness, not through acute pain, but through the need for constant vigilance and adaptation. You learned to drink lukewarm liquids instead of hot or cold ones, to breathe through your nose instead of your mouth during cold weather, to sleep positioned so that your weight didn't press on the sensitive area. Gradually, as the tooth continued to weaken, your mouth began to reorganize itself around the impending loss. Your tongue learned new patterns of movement for chewing and swallowing. Your other teeth began to take on additional responsibilities. Your jaw muscles adapted to new patterns of stress and movement. By the time the tooth was finally lost, whether through gradual crumbling or sudden fracture, your mouth was already prepared for its absence. The moment of actual tooth loss, when it finally came, might occur during any ordinary activity, biting into a piece of bread, chewing a bit of meat, or even simply yawning or speaking. The sensation was unmistakable. The sudden absence of resistance where resistance had always been before. The sharp edges of enamel where there should have been smooth surfaces, the taste of blood, and the tender emptiness of the socket left behind. But rather than marking the end of function, this moment of loss often brought unexpected relief. The chronic ache that had become a constant companion disappeared, replaced by the clean pain of a fresh wound that would heal and fade. The vigilance and careful management that had consumed mental energy for months or years was no longer necessary. The mouth could begin to settle into its new configuration, learning to work efficiently with one fewer tool, but without the distraction of protecting a failing one. Picture yourself now, fully inhabiting this medieval existence, as the candle burns lower and the sounds of the village fade into the deep quiet of night. Your tongue makes one final, unconscious survey of your teeth. These small, irreplaceable tools that stand between you and hunger, between clear speech and mumbled communication, between the confidence of a full smile and the self-consciousness of hiding your mouth behind your hand. In the darkness of your medieval cottage, surrounded by the familiar sounds and smells of your time and place, you might offer a small prayer, not for wealth or glory, but for the simple blessing of waking tomorrow with the same number of teeth you possess today. This humble request, repeated in countless bedchambers across medieval Europe night after night, century after century, speaks to a fundamental truth about human existence that our modern world of dental insurance and preventive care has largely forgotten. The teeth in your mouth represent more than just tools for eating. They are markers of your age and experience, signs of the life you have lived and the challenges you have faced. Each missing tooth tells a story of the day you bit down too hard on a nut, of the winter when food was scarce and you had to eat things that were barely edible, of the accident that chipped a front tooth and left you with a permanent reminder of a moment's carelessness. But they also represent resilience and adaptation, the remarkable capacity of the human body and spirit to continue functioning, continue finding joy and purpose, even as the physical foundation of existence slowly changes. The medieval person who had lost several teeth did not consider themselves broken or diminished, but rather experienced in the art of living, skilled in the countless small adaptations that allowed life to continue in the face of inevitable change. As sleep begins to claim you in your medieval bed, the straw rustling softly beneath your weight, the woolen blankets slowly warming with your body heat, let your final conscious thoughts drift toward gratitude for the simple miracle of a day survived, a family fed, a community sustained. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new demands on your teeth and your body, new opportunities to practice the ancient arts of adaptation and endurance that have allowed human beings to thrive in circumstances far more challenging than our modern minds can easily imagine. The rhythm of your breathing slows and deepens, matching the eternal rhythm that connects you to every human being who has ever lived. The slow, steady breath of survival, of persistence, of quiet dignity in the face of inevitable loss. In the darkness, your teeth rest behind your closed lips, ready to serve you through another day of medieval life for as long as they are able, and your mouth stands ready to adapt and continue when they are not. As we drift deeper into the medieval world, our breathing slowing to match the contemplative pace of monastic life, let us turn our attention to a particular soul whose struggle with dental affliction was recorded for posterity. Not because he was a king or a saint, but because his pain became so legendary within the walls of his monastery that it found its way into the careful chronicles kept by his fellow monks. The story of Brother Thomas of Whitmore Abbey offers us an intimate window into the medieval experience of dental crisis, told through the eyes of men who saw in physical suffering a reflection of spiritual truth. Brother Thomas lived during the harsh winter of 1347 in a stone monastery nestled among the rolling hills of what we now call Yorkshire. Picture this place in your mind's eye as you settle deeper into sleep. Massive walls of gray limestone rising from the earth like natural formations, their surfaces darkened by centuries of rain and wind, streaked with the green and black stains that speak of age beyond human memory. The monastery's windows were narrow slits, designed more for defense than illumination, and through these openings, the pale winter light filtered into spaces that had sheltered countless souls seeking peace, knowledge, and salvation. Within these walls lived 43 monks who had dedicated their lives to the threefold path of prayer, learning, and manual labor that defined the Benedictine tradition. Each day began before dawn with the ringing of the bell that called them to matins, their voices joining in the ancient chants that had echoed through these stones for over 2 centuries. The abbey was largely self-sufficient, its community sustained by the labor of their own hands. Fields of barley and oats, gardens of herbs and vegetables, workshops where they copied manuscripts, brewed ale, and crafted the tools and furnishings needed for their communal life. Brother Thomas was a man of middle years, perhaps 40 summers old, though the exact record of his birth had been lost in a fire that consumed part of the abbey's records 2 decades earlier. The fire itself was remembered as a minor catastrophe in the monastery's history, a summer evening when lightning struck the scriptorium tower and spread flames through the carefully ordered world of parchment and ink before the brothers could organize an effective response. Much was lost that night, including not only manuscripts, but also the mundane records that track the lives of individual monks, their origins, their families, the circumstances that had brought them to seek refuge behind monastery walls. What we know of Brother Thomas comes from the observations of his brothers, recorded in various documents that survived the fire. He was known among them for his beautiful handwriting, his careful formation of letters in the illuminated manuscripts that were the monastery's greatest treasure and source of income. His particular specialty was the copying of psalters, those collections of psalms that required not only perfect lettering, but also the delicate application of gold leaf and colored inks that transformed mere words into objects of divine beauty. Imagine Brother Thomas in his daily routine during the months before his great trial began, rising in the cold darkness before dawn, the stone floor of his cell chilling his bare feet as he fumbled for his sandals in the dim light filtering through the narrow window. The monastery at this hour was filled with the sound of rustling fabric as 43 men dressed themselves for prayer, the whisper of bare feet on stone as they made their way through corridors lit only by the occasional oil lamp, its flame casting dancing shadows on walls that had witnessed this same ritual for generations. The chapel during Matins was a space transformed by darkness and devotion. The massive stone columns that supported the vaulted ceiling disappeared into shadows above, while the altar area was illuminated by dozens of beeswax candles that filled the air with their clean, sweet scent. Brother Thomas's voice, trained through years of daily practice, blended seamlessly with those of his brothers as they chanted the ancient melodies that structured their days and seasons. His lips formed the Latin words with precision and care, the same attention to detail that characterized his manuscript work, extending even to this most fundamental act of monastic life. After the morning prayers came the first meal of the day, taken in the refectory, while one of the brothers read aloud from the lives of the saints. The meal itself was simple: dark bread, perhaps some porridge made from oats grown in the monastery's fields, an ale that was safer to drink than the water from many wells. The refectory was a long, narrow room with whitewashed walls and windows set high to prevent distraction during meals. Long wooden tables were arranged in precise rows, with benches that bore the polish of centuries of use. At the head of the room, the prior sat at a raised table, his presence a reminder of the hierarchy that governed even the most egalitarian aspects of monastic life. It was on a February morning, as the winter light struggled through ice-glazed windows and the brothers huddled in their woolen habits for warmth, that Brother Thomas bit into a particularly tough crust of bread and his ordeal began. The bread itself was typical of what the monastery produced during the lean winter months. Dense, coarse, made from a mixture of grains that had been carefully rationed to last until the next harvest. The baking was done in the great ovens that were heated only twice a week, producing loaves that were designed more for preservation than for ease of eating. The pain, as recorded in the Abbey's chronicle by Brother William the Chronicler, came upon him like a bolt of lightning from a clear sky, as if the Almighty himself had chosen to remind our brother of the temporary nature of all earthly comfort. One moment, Brother Thomas was chewing contentedly, his attention focused on the morning reading about Saint Agatha's martyrdom, finding in her courage a source of inspiration for the day ahead. The next moment, he was gripping the wooden table with both hands, his knuckles white with the strain, his face drained of color, unable to speak or cry out due to the intensity of the agony that seemed to radiate from somewhere deep within his upper jaw and spread through his entire skull. Picture the scene in that quiet refectory. 42 other monks turning to look at their suffering brother, some half rising from their wooden benches, the gentle morning routine shattered by this sudden crisis that seemed to transform their familiar companion into a stranger writhing in inexplicable torment. The brother who had been reading paused in his recitation, his voice trailing off as all attention focused on Brother Thomas, who sat frozen in his agony, unable to articulate his distress, pointing helplessly at his mouth while tears of pain streamed down his cheeks. Prior Benedict, a kind man in his 60s whose leadership of the community was marked by compassion tempered with practical wisdom, approached cautiously, his own experience with the ailments of aging making him sensitive to the suffering of his spiritual sons. With gentle hands weathered by years of manual labor and scholarly work, he examined Brother Thomas's mouth as best he could in the dim light filtering through the refectory's small windows, his fingers probing carefully around the area that seemed to be causing such distress. What Prior Benedict discovered would have been grimly familiar to anyone of that era. Brother Thomas's upper right molar, a tooth that had served faithfully for 4 decades of monastery bread and simple fare, had finally succumbed to the slow rot that began, perhaps, with a small cavity years earlier. The tooth had split vertically along its length, leaving sharp edges of enamel and exposing the tender pulp within to the cold morning air and the coarse texture of the bread. Each breath that Brother Thomas drew sent fresh waves of agony through the damaged nerve, and the pressure of his tongue against the tooth in an instinctive attempt to assess the damage only intensified his suffering. The chronicle records that Brother Thomas was immediately excused from his regular duties and taken to the monastery's infirmary, a small, stone-walled chamber that served as both hospital and pharmacy for the religious community. This room, located on the ground floor of the main building to ensure easy access for those too ill to climb stairs, had been designed with the practical needs of medieval medicine in mind. Its windows faced east to catch the morning light that was essential for examining patients and preparing medicines, while its thick walls and small size made it easier to heat during the long winter months when illness was most common. Here, Brother Anselm, who served as the Abbey's healer and herbalist, maintained his collection of medical supplies and pharmaceutical preparations. Brother Anselm was a learned man in his 50s who had come to the monastery after studying medicine at the cathedral school in York, bringing with him knowledge that bridged the gap between formal medical education and the practical herbal wisdom that had sustained rural communities for generations. His shelves were lined with ceramic pots containing dried herbs, leather pouches filled with various powders and compounds, and carefully labeled bottles of tinctures and extracts that represented years of careful preparation and accumulated wisdom. The examination of Brother Thomas's damaged tooth took place with the limited tools and knowledge available to medieval medicine. But within those constraints, it was conducted with skill and thoroughness. Brother Anselm used a small mirror of polished metal to reflect light into the patient's mouth, a technique he had learned from his medical training that allowed him to see areas that would otherwise remain hidden in shadow. His fingers, sensitive from years of examining patients and preparing medicines, probed gently around the damaged tooth, assessing the extent of the split and the condition of the surrounding tissue. Brother Anselm's approach to Brother Thomas's dental crisis reflected the medical understanding of his time, which viewed illness as fundamentally a matter of imbalance within the body's natural systems. According to the medical theory inherited from ancient Greek and Roman physicians and preserved in the texts that filled the monastery's library, tooth pain resulted from an excess of hot, corrupt humors that had settled in the jaw and required careful treatment to restore the proper balance. Imagine the scene in that infirmary as Brother Anselm moved around the small room with quiet efficiency, gathering the materials for his treatment while Brother Thomas lay on a simple wooden cot, his head supported by a pillow stuffed with dried herbs chosen for their supposed calming properties. Lavender and chamomile, grown in the monastery's garden and harvested at the peak of their potency. The room smelled of herbs and beeswax, with underlying notes of the various medicines that had been prepared there over the years, creating an atmosphere that spoke of healing tradition and careful craft. From his wooden shelves, Brother Anselm selected dried willow bark, known since ancient times for its pain-relieving properties, though the medieval understanding of why it worked was quite different from our modern knowledge of salicylic acid. He also chose oil of cloves, a precious substance that had made its way to the monastery through the complex trade networks that connected medieval Europe to distant lands. This oil, extracted from the flower buds of clove trees that grew only in certain tropical regions, represented a significant investment in both money and faith. Money because it was extraordinarily expensive, faith because its use was based on the accumulated wisdom of generations of healers who had found it effective for dental pain. The treatment began with the preparation of a decoction, willow bark boiled in water until the liquid took on a bitter, amber color and the active compounds had been extracted from the plant material. This process required careful attention to timing and temperature, skills that Brother Anselm had developed through years of practice and observation. The resulting liquid was strained through clean linen to remove any particles that might cause additional irritation, then allowed to cool to a temperature that would be soothing rather than shocking to the damaged tooth. Brother Thomas was instructed to hold this bitter liquid in his mouth, allowing it to bathe the damaged tooth while the natural compounds worked to dull the pain. The taste was harsh and medicinal, quite different from the mild flavors that dominated the monastery's simple cuisine, but the relief it provided was unmistakable. The sharp, constant agony that had made it impossible for him to think or speak gradually subsided to a duller, more manageable ache that allowed him to function, though he remained careful to chew only on the left side of his mouth. The clove oil treatment followed, applied directly to the damaged tooth with a small piece of clean linen wound around a slender wooden probe. This application required considerable skill, as the oil needed to reach the exposed nerve tissue without causing additional damage to the already compromised tooth structure. Brother Anselm's hands, steady from years of delicate work in preparing manuscripts and medicines, managed this procedure with the precision that medieval medical practice demanded. But medieval dental treatment, even when performed with skill and access to the best available materials, could offer only temporary respite rather than cure. The fundamental problem, a tooth split beyond repair, with nerve tissue exposed to infection and further damage, remained unchanged by the treatments available. Brother Anselm understood this limitation, and his approach focused on making Brother Thomas as comfortable as possible while nature took its inevitable course. The chronicle records that Brother Thomas's condition continued to deteriorate over the following weeks, Despite the faithful application of various treatments and the prayers offered by the entire community for his recovery, the initial sharp pain gave way to a duller, constant ache that proved in some ways more debilitating than the acute crisis that had marked the beginning of his ordeal. This chronic pain affected his ability to concentrate on his manuscript work. The precision and artistry that had made his illuminations famous throughout the region becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. Picture Brother Thomas during this period of decline, attempting to continue his daily routine while his body fought its losing battle against dental decay. In the scriptorium, the cold stone chamber where the monks labored over their manuscripts during the daylight hours, his beautiful lettering began to show the effects of his distraction and discomfort. The careful formation of letters that had once flowed from his pen with unconscious precision became shaky and uneven as waves of pain clouded his concentration. The work of manuscript illumination required not just artistic skill, but also physical steadiness and mental focus that Brother Thomas found increasingly difficult to maintain. The delicate application of gold leaf, which demanded absolute control and timing, became nearly impossible when sudden spasms of pain would cause his hand to tremble at crucial moments. More than once, a particularly severe surge of agony caused him to make an error that ruined hours of careful work. The precious vellum marked with ink blots or improperly applied decorative elements that could not be corrected. His fellow scribes, bound by the rules of their order regarding silence during work hours, could offer only subtle assistance, positioning themselves nearby to share body warmth in the drafty chamber, occasionally steadying his writing desk when they noticed his hands shaking, or quietly taking over the more demanding technical aspects of manuscript preparation, while Brother Thomas focused on the simpler tasks that his condition still allowed him to perform adequately. The progressive nature of Brother Thomas's dental crisis affected every aspect of his monastic life. During the long hours of prayer that structured each day, standing in the cold chapel while chanting the various offices, he found his attention drawn again and again to the throbbing in his jaw. The pain seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat, creating a constant distraction that made it difficult to achieve the contemplative focus that was central to monastic spirituality. The physical act of chanting, which required precise control of breathing and clear articulation of Latin syllables, became increasingly challenging as Brother Thomas learned to modify his pronunciation to avoid putting pressure on the damaged tooth. Certain combinations of sounds that required the tongue to press against the upper teeth became sources of fresh pain, forcing him to develop new ways of forming words that maintained the beauty of the chant while protecting his mouth from additional trauma. During meals in the refectory, the community's careful attention to Brother Thomas's condition became evident in countless small acts of kindness that spoke to the bonds of brotherhood that sustained monastic life. His fellow monks, without discussion or formal arrangement, began to select the softest pieces of bread for him, ensuring that his portion contained fewer of the hard crusts that had triggered his original crisis. When pottage was served, they made sure his bowl contained the smoothest, most thoroughly cooked portions, while the chewier bits were quietly distributed among those whose teeth could still handle such challenges. These gestures of support extended beyond mere practical assistance to encompass the emotional and spiritual dimensions of Brother Thomas's struggle. The monastic community understood that physical suffering was not simply a medical problem to be solved, but a spiritual challenge that required the support of the entire brotherhood. Their response reflected the theological understanding that individual suffering was connected to the broader human condition, requiring both practical care and spiritual solidarity. As winter deepened and the monastery's stores of fresh food dwindled, Brother Thomas's condition worsened significantly. The preserved foods that sustained the community through the cold months, salt pork, dried peas, hard cheese aged to the consistency of stone, were particularly challenging for someone with severe dental problems. Each meal became an exercise in creative adaptation as Brother Thomas learned to eat in new ways, soaking hard foods in warm liquid until they softened, using his tongue and the roof of his mouth to mash foods that his teeth could no longer handle effectively. The monastery's ale, which normally provided both nutritional sustenance and mild pain relief through its alcohol content, seemed to aggravate his damaged tooth with its slight acidity. This discovery forced Brother Thomas to give up one of the few pleasures available in monastic life, limiting himself to water and the occasional cup of herbal tea prepared by Brother Anselm from the infirmary supply of medicinal plants. By the feast of St. Thomas in December, an irony that was not lost on the suffering monk or his compassionate brothers, Brother Thomas could no longer eat solid food at all. Brother Anselm began preparing special meals for him. Rich broths made from bones and scraps of meat that would otherwise have been discarded, gruels so thin they could be swallowed without chewing, and warm wines mixed with honey that provided some nourishment while offering mild analgesic effects. It was during this period of liquid sustenance that Brother Thomas experienced what the Chronicle describes as a revelation of compassion that transformed his understanding of charity and brought forth writings of great beauty and spiritual insight. Unable to partake fully in the communal meals that were so central to monastic life, he began to understand in a profound way the suffering of those who came to the monastery's gates seeking charity. The abbey, like many religious houses, regularly distributed food to the poor and traveling pilgrims, a practice that was both a religious obligation and a practical necessity in a world where social welfare was largely the responsibility of religious institutions. But Brother Thomas had never before considered how many of these recipients might be struggling with their own dental afflictions, their own inability to enjoy the simple blessing of a proper meal. From his cot in the infirmary, as the winter wind rattled the shutters and the sound of his brothers chanting the office of Compline drifted through the stone walls, Brother Thomas began to compose what he called his meditations on suffering. These writings, dictated to Brother William when the pain allowed him to speak clearly, offer us a unique window into the medieval experience of chronic pain and the spiritual meaning that could be derived from physical suffering. The Lord, Brother Thomas dictated in his weakened voice, his words carefully recorded by Brother William in the clear script that would preserve them for future generations, has granted me a small portion of his own passion. And though my agony is but a grain of sand compared to his sacrifice upon the cross, it teaches me the weight of every morsel of bread, the blessing of every cup of wine that passes my lips without pain. I understand now why he chose to feed the multitudes, not only to satisfy their hunger, but to give them the joy of eating without suffering, the simple pleasure of chewing and swallowing that I once took as my natural right. These meditations continued throughout the darkest months of winter, as Brother Thomas's condition fluctuated between periods of manageable discomfort and episodes of acute agony that left him unable to speak or think clearly. His writings during this time reflected not bitterness or despair, but rather a deepening understanding of the connections between physical suffering and spiritual growth, between personal pain and universal compassion. In my cell at night, he continued in another passage, when the darkness is complete and my brothers sleep in peace, I feel the presence of all those who have suffered as I suffer now. Not only the great martyrs whose names we remember and whose feast days we celebrate, but the countless unknown souls who have endured the failure of their bodies with patience and grace. In my small pain, I touch something larger than myself, a communion of suffering that stretches across time and space, connecting me to every human soul who has ever felt the betrayal of flesh that was meant to serve but has become a source of torment. The theological sophistication of these meditations impressed even the learned doctors who occasionally visited the abbey, and word of Brother Thomas's spiritual insights began to spread beyond the monastery walls. Copies of his writings were requested by other religious houses, and scholars from the cathedral schools began to cite his work in their own treatises on the relationship between physical suffering and spiritual development. But the most remarkable aspect of Brother Thomas's ordeal, as recorded in the monastery's chronicles, was the transformation it brought about in the community's understanding of charity and mutual support. His visible suffering, endured with patience and grace, served as a daily reminder to his brothers of the fragility of physical health and the importance of compassion in their dealings with each other and with the outside world. The end of Brother Thomas's dental ordeal came not through healing or medical intervention, but through the inevitable progression of decay and the body's own mechanisms of adaptation. On a gray February morning, exactly 11 months after his crisis had begun, as he attempted his usual morning ritual of rinsing his mouth with Brother Anselm's willow bark decoction, the remnants of his damaged tooth simply crumbled away, leaving behind an empty socket that bled freely, but, after the initial shock, caused him no further pain. The Chronicle records that Brother Thomas wept when he realized his suffering had ended. Not tears of pain, but tears of relief so profound that they seemed to cleanse not just his physical agony, but the spiritual anguish that had accompanied his long ordeal. For the first time in nearly a year, he could drink cold water without flinching, could speak without carefully positioning his tongue to avoid sensitive areas, could join fully in the communal prayers without the distraction of constant pain. The moment of the tooth's final departure was witnessed by Brother Anselm, who had come to the infirmary to check on his patient's condition during the morning hours. He later described the scene as one of the most moving he had experienced in his years of medical practice. Brother Thomas, sitting on the edge of his cot, holding in his palm the fragments of enamel and root that had caused him such prolonged suffering, his face transformed by an expression of wonder and gratitude that seemed to illuminate the entire room. "It is finished," Brother Thomas whispered, his voice clear and strong for the first time in months. The words carried not just relief at the end of physical pain, but a deeper recognition of completion, of having passed through a trial that had transformed his understanding of himself and his relationship to both his community and his God. But the loss of the tooth brought its own challenges and adaptations that would mark the remainder of Brother Thomas's life. He had to learn new ways of eating, carefully positioning food on the left side of his mouth, cutting meat into smaller pieces, avoiding foods that required significant grinding with a missing molar. His speech, too, required adjustment. Certain combinations of letters produced a slight whistle where air escaped through the gap in his teeth, and he had to consciously modify his pronunciation during the public reading of prayers and scripture. Perhaps most significantly for Brother Thomas's identity as a scribe and illuminator, the loss of his tooth affected his breathing patterns in subtle ways that influenced his manuscript work. The steady, controlled breathing that allowed for the precise application of ink and gold leaf had to be relearned, adapted to accommodate the slightly different airflow through his mouth. His handwriting, when he finally returned to the scriptorium in the spring following his recovery, bore the subtle marks of this adaptation, still beautiful and precise, but bearing the characteristics of a man who had been fundamentally changed by his ordeal. The manuscripts that Brother Thomas produced in the years following his dental crisis are considered among the finest examples of medieval illumination to survive from that period. But those who knew him well could detect in his later work a quality that had not been present before, a deeper sensitivity to human suffering that expressed itself in the faces of saints and martyrs, a greater attention to the details of daily life that appeared in the marginal decorations, and an overall sense of compassion and understanding that seemed to infuse every aspect of his artistic production. The Chronicle concludes Brother Thomas's story with a notation made years later, recording that he lived another 2 decades after the loss of his tooth, completing some of the monastery's most treasured manuscripts and training a generation of younger monks in the arts of calligraphy and illumination. His teaching method, according to the accounts of his students, was marked by extraordinary patience and gentleness, qualities that seemed to flow naturally from his own experience of prolonged suffering and eventual adaptation. Those who worked closely with him noted that he never again bit directly into hard bread, always breaking it into small pieces before eating. He developed the habit of carrying a small knife for cutting food, and his cell contained a collection of wooden bowls and cups designed to make eating and drinking easier for someone with missing teeth. More tellingly, he would sometimes pause in his work to run his tongue gently over the gap where his tooth had been, not from pain or regret, but as a quiet reminder of the months when even the simple act of swallowing had required courage and determination. Brother Thomas's story, preserved in the careful chronicles of Whitmore Abbey, reminds us that behind the grand narratives of medieval history, the wars and political intrigue, the rise and fall of kingdoms, the theological debates that shaped religious thought, lay the quieter struggles of ordinary people dealing with the fundamental challenges of human existence. His chronicle serves as a bridge between our own experience of dental pain, brief and treatable as it usually is, and the medieval reality where such pain might become a companion for months or years, shaping not just physical comfort, but spiritual understanding and daily identity. The detailed record of his ordeal also reveals the sophisticated support systems that existed within medieval religious communities, the ways that institutions designed around spiritual goals nevertheless developed practical methods for caring for members who faced physical challenges. The monastery's response to Brother Thomas's suffering, medical care, dietary accommodation, work modification, emotional support, and spiritual guidance, demonstrates that medieval society, despite its limitations, possessed remarkable capacity for compassion and adaptation. As we prepare to move forward in our journey through medieval dental experience, let us carry with us the image of Brother Thomas, a man whose beautiful handwriting was interrupted by pain, whose prayers were complicated by physical suffering, but whose ultimate response to his ordeal was not bitterness, but deeper understanding, not withdrawal, but greater engagement with the human condition in all its vulnerability and resilience. His story reminds us that the experience of losing a tooth in the Middle Ages was never simply a medical event, but always a human drama that touched every aspect of life and offered opportunities for both suffering and growth, for both individual adaptation and community solidarity. In the hushed corridors of museums and the sterile precision of archaeological laboratories, where climate-controlled environments preserve the remnants of lives lived centuries ago, medieval skulls rest in carefully cataloged rows, their empty eye sockets gazing eternally into fluorescent-lit nothing. Yet these silent witnesses, these repositories of calcium and phosphate that once held the dreams and sorrows of individual human beings, speak more eloquently than any written chronicle about what it truly meant to lose a tooth in the Middle Ages. Tonight, as your breathing deepens and your mind settles into the contemplative rhythm of archaeological investigation, let us become detectives of the distant past, examining the physical evidence left behind by people who lived and died when the world was young and dental science was yet unborn. Picture yourself descending into the basement laboratory of a modern university, where the harsh brightness of fluorescent lights casts a steady, clinical glow over rows of metal examination tables. Here, in this temple to scientific precision, specialists in medieval archaeology work with tools that would seem magical to Brother Thomas and his contemporaries. Digital calipers that measure bone thickness to fractions of millimeters, electron microscopes that reveal details invisible to the naked eye, and computer programs that can reconstruct entire faces from the bare architecture of skull bones, bringing the dead to vivid, three-dimensional life. The air in this subterranean workspace carries the faint, institutional scent of preservation chemicals mingled with the quiet hum of climate control systems working constantly to maintain the perfect environment for these ancient remains. The temperature is kept precisely cool, the humidity controlled to prevent the gradual degradation that threatens all organic materials, while specialized air filtration systems remove the microscopic particles that could contaminate specimens or interfere with the delicate analytical procedures that modern archaeology demands. On one particular examination table, under the focus beam of an adjustable laboratory lamp, rests the skull of a woman who died sometime in the 14th century, discovered during the systematic excavation of a churchyard that had served a thriving medieval market town for over 3 centuries. The excavation itself had been a painstaking process, each burial carefully mapped and photographed before removal. The soil around each skeleton sifted through fine mesh screens to recover the smallest artifacts, buttons, pins, fragments of clothing, coins, and personal items that could tell the story of how these people lived and died. The archaeologists have designated her as Burial 47, a clinical designation that speaks to the methodical nature of modern scientific investigation. But as we examine her remains with the patience that archaeological work demands, we begin to piece together a story as personal and detailed as that of Brother Thomas, written not in ink on parchment, but in the language of bone density, tooth wear patterns, and the subtle chemical signatures that preserve the record of a life lived 7 centuries ago. Her skull tells us immediately that she lived a life of physical challenge and adaptation. The bone itself is robust and well-developed, indicating good nutrition during the crucial years of childhood and adolescence, when the basic architecture of the skeleton is established. The cranial sutures, those zigzag joints where the different sections of the skull fuse together during growth, suggest she lived to perhaps 45 years of age, a respectable lifespan for the medieval period, when infectious diseases, inadequate nutrition, and the physical demands of daily life combined to create mortality patterns very different from those we know today. But it is when we examine her teeth, or rather the striking absence of so many of them, that her true story begins to unfold with the clarity that only scientific analysis can provide. Of the 32 teeth that should occupy an adult human mouth, this woman retained only 18 when she died. The missing teeth were not lost all at once in some traumatic accident. A fall from a horse, a blow to the face during a violent encounter, or the kind of sudden catastrophe that might befall anyone in any era, but gradually, over many years, each loss marking a small crisis that she somehow survived and adapted to with a remarkable resilience that characterizes human beings throughout history. The archaeologist can read the sequence of these dental losses like chapters in a carefully written book, each empty socket telling its own story of pain, adaptation, and the body's remarkable ability to heal and reorganize itself around absent structures. The techniques they use to extract this information represent the culmination of decades of research in forensic anthropology, dental archaeology, and the emerging field of paleopathology, which seeks to understand the diseases and health challenges faced by people in the distant past. Imagine yourself leaning closer to examine the evidence, perhaps wearing the white cotton gloves that protect both the precious specimens and the researcher from contamination. Your eyes focused on details that require training and experience to interpret correctly. In the upper jaw, you can see immediately that this woman lost her front teeth, the incisors and canines that are essential for biting and tearing food, relatively early in her adult life, probably during her 20s or early 30s based on the advanced degree of bone remodeling that has occurred in the empty sockets. This bone remodeling process, which modern medicine calls alveolar bone resorption, represents the body's response to tooth loss, a gradual reshaping of the jaw structure that continues for months or even years after a tooth is lost. The smooth, rounded appearance of the bone where teeth once stood tells us that this woman survived these early dental losses by many years, her body adapting to the changed circumstances with the same biological wisdom that allows broken bones to heal and wounds to close. The loss of front teeth would have profoundly affected this woman's ability to perform the basic functions of daily life that we take for granted. Foods that form the staple of any diet, apples, crusty bread, strips of dried meat, would have become impossible to manage in the normal way. She would have had to develop entirely new eating strategies, cutting food into small pieces before putting in her mouth, using her remaining back teeth exclusively for all chewing functions, perhaps pre-softening tough foods by soaking them in liquid or by the kind of patient gnawing that gradually breaks down resistant textures. But the archaeological evidence reveals something even more intriguing about this woman's adaptations to dental loss, something that speaks to the ingenuity and determination that characterized medieval people's response to physical challenges. On several of her remaining back teeth, the researchers have identified what they call task-specific wear patterns, areas where the tooth enamel has been worn down in unusual configurations that suggest the teeth were being used for purposes that went far beyond their original biological function of processing food. These wear patterns can only be detected and analyzed using the sophisticated equipment available to modern archaeology. Scanning electron microscopes, which can magnify tooth surfaces thousands of times beyond what the human eye can perceive, reveal tiny parallel scratches, areas of polish, and distinctive patterns of erosion that tell the story of how these teeth were used day after day, year after year, in the service of survival and productivity. The microscopic analysis indicates that this woman was using her remaining molars not just for chewing food, but for tasks that normally would have been accomplished with the sharper, more precise front teeth that she had lost. The evidence suggests that she used her back teeth to strip plant fibers for textile work, processing the raw materials that would eventually become thread for weaving or rope for various household and agricultural purposes. The distinctive wear patterns also indicate that she used her teeth to hold materials steady while working with her hands, and to perform the countless small tasks that required a firm grip and steady pressure. Picture the daily life that created these remarkable wear patterns. This medieval woman, having lost her front teeth to decay or injury, refused to allow this physical limitation to prevent her from contributing to her household's economic survival. Instead, she developed innovative techniques that allowed her to continue productive work, using her remaining teeth as specialized tools in ways that gradually modified their structure but preserve her ability to earn a living and maintain her independence. This adaptation speaks to something remarkable about medieval people that often gets overlooked in our modern understanding of the period. Rather than being overwhelmed by physical limitations or accepting a reduced role in their communities, they displayed extraordinary ingenuity in finding ways to maintain their productivity and dignity. This woman's teeth show us that losing the proper tools for a job didn't mean abandoning the work. It meant innovating new methods, even if those methods gradually wore down the remaining tools she had available. The story becomes even more complex and fascinating when we examine evidence for deliberate dental modification found in other medieval burials excavated from the same region. In a cemetery discovered beneath what was once the marketplace of a prosperous medieval town, archaeologists found the remains of a middle-aged man whose teeth had been deliberately filed and shaped, apparently to create better grip surfaces for his work in rope making and textile production. The front edges of his incisors showed carefully controlled, where that could only have resulted from decades of drawing rough hemp fibers across the teeth to soften and separate them. This practice, which would seem barbaric to modern sensibilities, was actually a sophisticated adaptation that allowed him to perform essential work with greater efficiency and precision. The deliberate modification of his teeth represented a conscious choice to sacrifice long-term dental health for immediate economic necessity, a trade-off that medieval people made with full understanding of the consequences. Archaeological evidence from across medieval Europe reveals that this practice of using teeth as specialized tools was so common that researchers can often determine a person's occupation simply by examining the patterns of dental wear on their skeletal remains. Tailors and seamstresses show characteristic notches in their front teeth from cutting thread and holding needles, the repeated action of biting through fiber creating distinctive grooves that are as clear as fingerprints to the trained archaeological eye. Cobblers display specific wear patterns from holding small nails and tacks between their teeth while working on shoes and leather goods. Their dental modifications reflecting the demands of a trade that required both hands to be free while maintaining precise control over small metal objects. Musicians who played wind instruments made from wood, bone, or metal show distinctive wear on the teeth that contacted their instruments' mouthpieces, the repetitive pressure of musical performance leaving permanent marks that can still be detected centuries after the last note was played. But perhaps the most intriguing archaeological discoveries relate to medieval attempts at dental treatment and repair, evidence that challenges our assumptions about the sophistication of medieval medicine and the ingenuity of people faced with dental problems. In a cemetery excavated in Denmark, archaeologists uncovered the skull of a man who had attempted to replace a lost front tooth with a carefully carved piece of walrus ivory, a prosthetic device that represents remarkable skill and determination in an age without anesthesia or proper surgical instruments. The replacement tooth had been shaped with extraordinary precision to match the size and contours of his natural teeth, then drilled with a tiny hole through which a fine golden wire was passed to anchor it to the adjacent teeth. The carving work alone would have required considerable skill and access to specialized tools, while the surgical procedure necessary to install the prosthetic would have demanded not only technical knowledge, but also remarkable courage on the part of both patient and practitioner. Imagine the process that led to this remarkable piece of medieval dental engineering. Someone, perhaps the man himself, working with mirrors and improvised tools, or possibly a craftsperson with unusual medical knowledge, had to carve the replacement tooth to precisely the right size and shape, drill the microscopic holes needed for the anchoring wire, and then somehow perform the delicate surgery needed to install it in a living mouth. The archaeological evidence suggests that this improvised dental implant actually functioned successfully for several years before the man's death, showing slight wear patterns that indicate he was able to use it for eating and speaking. The physical evidence also reveals fascinating insights into cultural attitudes toward dental loss in medieval society. Insights that can only be gained through the systematic analysis of burial practices and grave goods found in association with human remains. In many excavated cemeteries, archaeologists have discovered that individuals with significant tooth loss were buried with the same care and respect as those with complete dentition. Their graves containing similar quantities and types of personal objects, religious items, and markers of social status. This archaeological evidence suggests that dental problems, while certainly undesirable and potentially debilitating, did not necessarily mark someone as socially inferior or unworthy of respect within their community. The democratic nature of dental disease, its ability to affect people of all social classes and economic circumstances, may have contributed to a cultural attitude that viewed tooth loss as an unfortunate but normal aspect of aging rather than as a shameful condition that diminished a person's worth or social standing. However, careful analysis of burial data reveals intriguing regional and social variations in how dental problems were treated and perceived. In cemeteries associated with monasteries and other religious institutions, where literacy rates were higher and access to medical knowledge was better, the archaeological evidence shows more frequent attempts at dental treatment and repair. The remains of monks, nuns, and other religious people show evidence of more sophisticated pain management techniques and occasionally even primitive forms of dental surgery. Secular cemeteries associated with wealthy merchant families or noble households also show evidence of better dental care, including the use of imported medicines and treatments that would have been far beyond the reach of ordinary peasants. These social differences in access to dental care are reflected not only in the degree of tooth loss found in different populations, but also in the types of wear patterns, the evidence for professional treatment, and the overall health status indicated by the skeletal remains. The teeth themselves preserve chemical evidence of medieval diet and health that allows modern scientists to reconstruct remarkably detailed pictures of how individual people lived, what they ate, where they traveled, and even what kinds of stress they experienced during their lifetimes. Isotope analysis of tooth enamel can reveal whether someone grew up during a time of famine or relative plenty, whether their diet was primarily agricultural or included significant amounts of marine protein from fish and other seafood, and even whether they moved from one geographic region to another during their lifetime. The techniques used for this analysis involve extracting tiny samples of tooth enamel and subjecting them to mass spectrometry, a process that can identify the specific ratios of different chemical isotopes that were incorporated into the tooth structure during formation. These isotope ratios serve as a kind of chemical fingerprint that reflects the environmental conditions and dietary patterns of the individual's childhood and youth when the permanent teeth were developing beneath the gums. One particularly fascinating discovery involves the analysis of dental calculus, the hardened plaque that builds up on teeth over time and that medieval people had no effective way to remove. This calculus, when examined under powerful microscopes and subjected to chemical analysis, contains microscopic remains of the foods people ate, pollen from the air they breathed, textile fibers that reveal information about their clothing and living conditions, and even bacterial DNA that can tell us about the diseases and infections they carried. In some cases, archaeologists have been able to identify specific spices and herbs preserved in medieval dental calculus, providing direct evidence of individual diets and the complex trade networks that brought exotic substances from distant lands to ordinary European communities. Traces of black pepper, cinnamon, ginger, and other valuable spices have been found in the dental calculus of people who lived in relatively modest circumstances, suggesting that access to luxury foods was more widespread than historical documents might indicate. The calculus analysis has also revealed evidence of medieval attempts at dental hygiene that aren't well documented in written sources. Microscopic plant fibers found embedded in hardened plaques suggest that people were using rudimentary toothpicks made from twigs, grasses, or specially prepared wooden splinters to remove food particles from between their teeth. Some calculus samples contain traces of abrasive substances like ground pumice, charcoal, or even sand, indicating that medieval people were attempting to clean their teeth using primitive toothpastes or scouring compounds. Perhaps most remarkably, chemical analysis of medieval teeth has revealed evidence of sophisticated pain management techniques that demonstrate a level of medical knowledge that far exceeds what most historical documents suggest. Some skulls show traces of willow bark compounds concentrated in the tooth enamel, confirming that people were using this natural source of salicylic acid, the active ingredient in modern aspirin, specifically for dental pain relief. Other teeth contain traces of opium alkaloids, suggesting that this powerful painkiller was sometimes available for severe dental problems, though probably only to the wealthy or to those with connections to international trade networks. The presence of these compounds in tooth enamel indicates that pain management was administered over extended periods, suggesting systematic treatment regimens rather than occasional emergency interventions. The archaeological record also preserves evidence of the social and community aspects of dental care that reveal the sophisticated support systems that existed within medieval society. In some medieval cemeteries, researchers have found evidence of what they call communal dental care, skulls that show signs of dental procedures that would have required assistance from multiple people working together. Tooth extractions, for instance, often required someone to hold the patient steady while another person performed the actual removal of the damaged tooth. The bone evidence suggests that these procedures were sometimes successful, with proper healing and no signs of serious infection or complications, indicating that medieval communities had developed effective methods for supporting people through dental crises and ensuring that necessary medical procedures could be performed safely. One of the most moving archaeological discoveries relates to the care of elderly people who had suffered extensive dental loss, but who continued to receive community support that allowed them to survive and thrive despite their physical limitations. In a cemetery excavated in southern England, archaeologists found the remains of an elderly woman who had lost all her teeth many years before her death. Yet chemical analysis of her bones revealed that she had maintained excellent nutrition until the very end of her life. This finding was only possible because someone, family members, religious caretakers, or community members acting out of simple human compassion, had taken the time and effort to prepare soft foods for her on a daily basis, ensuring that she could continue to eat properly and maintain her health despite her complete inability to chew solid food. The evidence suggests that this care continued for many years, representing a significant commitment of time and resources by people who could have easily justified abandoning someone who was no longer economically productive. This archaeological evidence of long-term care for the dentally disabled contrasts sharply with popular misconceptions about medieval life as brutish, uncaring, and dominated by pure survival instincts. Instead, the physical evidence consistently shows that medieval communities found ways to support members who face serious physical challenges, including severe dental problems, and that these societies often adapted their practices and expectations to accommodate different needs and abilities rather than simply abandoning those who could no longer contribute in traditional ways. The mystery deepens when we consider the fascinating regional variations in dental health that archaeological evidence reveals across different parts of medieval Europe. Populations living in coastal areas with access to seafood generally show significantly better dental health than their inland counterparts, apparently due to higher levels of natural fluoride in their diet from marine sources, along with the beneficial effects of the minerals and nutrients found in fish and other sea creatures. Communities located near natural salt deposits also tend to show fewer dental problems in their skeletal remains. possibly because the salt they consumed contained trace minerals that help preserve tooth enamel and fight the bacterial infections that cause tooth decay. These regional differences in dental health were probably not understood by medieval people themselves, but they created significant variations in quality of life and life expectancy that can still be detected in the archaeological record centuries later. Interestingly, some of the best preserved medieval teeth come from the coldest regions of Northern Europe, where the harsh climate may have actually helped preserve dental health by limiting the growth of the bacteria that cause tooth decay and gum disease. These northern populations also tended to consume more dairy products and fermented foods as part of their traditional diets, substances that may have provided protective benefits for tooth enamel and overall oral health. The archaeological investigation of medieval dental health also reveals surprising information about the relationship between social class and access to effective dental care. While we might expect that wealthy people would always have had better teeth than their poorer neighbors, the evidence is more complex and sometimes contradictory. Some wealthy individuals show extensive dental problems that appear to result from diets high in sugar and refined foods that were available only to the very rich, while some peasant populations show remarkably good dental health that seems to result from simple diets and active lifestyles. As we prepare to leave this archaeological laboratory and move forward in our exploration of medieval dental experience, take a moment to imagine the faces that once surrounded these ancient skulls, the voices that once spoke through mouths that are now empty bone, the smiles and grimaces and expressions of pain or joy that animated these structures when they were part of living, breathing human beings. Each empty socket, each worn tooth surface, each healed extraction site represents not just a medical problem solved or endured, but a human story of adaptation, community support, and the remarkable resilience that has characterized our species throughout its long history. The silent testimony of these medieval remains reminds us that while the specific challenges of dental health have changed dramatically over the centuries, and while our methods of treatment have advanced beyond anything that medieval people could have imagined, the fundamental human experiences of pain, adaptation, and mutual care remain constant across the ages. In the precision of modern archaeological science, we find echoes of the same creativity and determination that allowed Brother Thomas to continue his manuscript work despite months of suffering, and that enabled countless unnamed medieval people to live full, productive lives despite the loss of teeth that we, in our comfortable modern world, consider essential to normal function and social acceptance. As our gentle journey through the medieval world of dental experience draws toward its contemplative conclusion, we must acknowledge a truth that runs like a silver thread through all of human history, that pain and privilege have never been equally distributed among the children of any age. The loss of a tooth carried vastly different meanings and consequences depending on whether that tooth belonged to a peasant working the muddy fields at dawn or a lord dining on delicacies in his castle's great hall by candlelight. Tonight, as your breathing deepens and your mind settles into the rhythm of sleep, let us explore these contrasts with the same quiet curiosity we have brought to our earlier explorations, understanding that even in suffering, perhaps especially in suffering, medieval society maintained the rigid hierarchies that defined every aspect of existence from cradle to grave. Picture, if you will, the great hall of a nobleman's castle on a winter evening in the year 1398, when the world was still young and the age of exploration had not yet begun to reshape European consciousness. The massive stone walls, thick enough to withstand siege engines and winter storms alike, are hung with colorful tapestries imported from Flanders and Constantinople, their rich reds and deep blues serving not only as decoration, but as insulation against the bitter cold that seeps through even the finest masonry. These tapestries tell stories, scenes from classical mythology, episodes from the lives of saints, allegorical representations of the virtues and vices. Their threads spun from the finest wool and silk, dyed with colors that cost more than a peasant family might see in several years of labor. The floor is covered with rushes harvested from the estate's marshlands and mixed with dried herbs, lavender, rosemary, mint, and sweet woodruff. that release their fragrance as they are crushed underfoot by the assembled company. Fresh rushes are laid weekly during the winter months, a luxury that speaks to the wealth and status of the household, while the herbs serve both practical and aesthetic purposes, masking the odors that inevitably accumulate in any large gathering, while providing a sensory experience that marks this space as different from the utilitarian environments where most people spend their lives. Dozens of beeswax candles provide a warm, steady light that dances across the faces of the assembled company, their clean flame and sweet scent a marked contrast to the tallow candles that provide illumination for lesser households. Beeswax was expensive, requiring either the maintenance of extensive hives or costly purchases from traveling merchants. But its superior light quality was considered essential for the evening entertainments that marked aristocratic life. The candles are held in elaborate candelabra of wrought iron and precious metals, their flickering flames creating pools of golden light that highlight the rich fabrics and gleaming jewelry worn by the evening's guests. The company itself represents the complex social ecosystem that surrounded medieval nobility. Knights and their ladies dressed in their finest clothing, the rich velvets and silks that marked their status, their garments decorated with embroidery that required months of skilled needlework to complete, visiting merchants whose wealth was sufficient to merit an invitation to the Lord's table. Their clothing perhaps less elaborate, but still far superior to anything worn by common folk. Learned clerks whose education and administrative skills made them valuable to the noble household, and the various hangers-on, distant relatives, and minor courtiers who made up the broader community that sustained aristocratic power and culture. At the high table, elevated on a wooden platform that literally and symbolically marks his position above all others present, sits Lord Geoffrey de Montfort, a man of perhaps 50 years whose lands stretch across 3 counties and whose word is law for thousands of souls. His appearance speaks immediately of privilege and power. His clothing is made from the finest materials available, his tunic of deep blue wool imported from Flanders, his cloak lined with fur from animals trapped in the forests of his domain. Jeweled rings adorn his fingers, their precious stones catching and reflecting the candlelight, while a golden chain around his neck supports a pendant that marks his membership in an exclusive chivalric order. As the evening meal progresses through its elaborate courses, roasted peacock with its feathers carefully reattached for display, a practice that required considerable skill and time from the kitchen staff. Delicate pastries shaped like castles and filled with spiced meats, their creation representing hours of specialized culinary artistry. Wines from distant vineyards served in goblets of polished silver that reflect the light like liquid mercury. Those observant enough might notice that Lord Geoffrey chews with careful deliberation, favoring the left side of his mouth, and that his smile, when it appears during conversation, is somewhat guarded, as if he is conscious of something he prefers not to reveal. Lord Geoffrey, you see, lost his upper right canine tooth some months earlier, not to the slow decay that claimed the teeth of common folk, but to violence of a more aristocratic sort. During a tournament held to celebrate his eldest son's betrothal to the daughter of a neighboring lord, an alliance that would unite 2 great estates and strengthen both families' political position. His opponent's lance had struck his helmet at an unfortunate angle during the grand melee that served as the day's climactic entertainment. The impact had driven a piece of the helmet's interior padding, reinforced with metal studs for protection, against his jaw with enough force to loosen the tooth and crack its root. The crowd had cheered the skillful blow, seeing it as evidence of both combatants' prowess, while Lord Geoffrey had continued fighting, his training and aristocratic code preventing him from acknowledging pain or weakness before his peers and subjects. It was only later, as the tournament wounds were being tended in private, that the full extent of the dental damage became apparent. Within days, despite the ministrations of his personal physician and the application of every remedy known to medieval medicine, the tooth had died and begun to decay, requiring extraction to prevent the spread of infection that could threaten not just his health but his life. Yet observe how differently this dental loss affected a man of Lord Geoffrey's station compared to the experiences we have witnessed among common folk. How privilege could transform even suffering into an opportunity to display wealth and access to resources that were simply unimaginable for ordinary people. When his tooth began to pain him seriously, Lord Geoffrey did not suffer in silence. Attempting to treat himself with whatever herbs he could gather from hedgerows and fields, nor did he rely on the folk wisdom passed down through generations of peasant families. Instead, he sent messengers riding hard across the countryside, their horses lathered from urgent travel, to summon Master Bernard, a physician whose reputation for treating the ailments of nobles had spread throughout the kingdom and earned him a comfortable living traveling from castle to castle, manor to manor, wherever his specialized services were required. Master Bernard's credentials were impeccable by medieval standards. He had studied at the medical school in Salerno, Italy, where the works of ancient Greek and Roman physicians were preserved and taught alongside more recent discoveries in anatomy and treatment. His knowledge encompassed not only the theoretical foundations of medieval medicine, the balance of humors, the influence of planetary movements on health, the proper timing of medical interventions according to the phases of the moon, but also practical experience gained through years of treating similar cases among the European nobility. Imagine Master Bernard's arrival at Lord Geoffrey's castle after several days of hard travel. A learned man in his middle years, his appearance marking him immediately as someone of education and refinement, riding a fine palfrey whose breeding and care represented a significant investment in both money and status. His clothing, while practical for travel, was made from quality materials and cut in the latest fashion, while his bearing and demeanor spoke of someone accustomed to moving in aristocratic circles and dealing with powerful people as equals rather than supplicants. He was accompanied by a servant leading a pack horse loaded with wooden chests containing his medical supplies, an arsenal of sophisticated treatments that reflected both his formal education and his access to expensive materials from distant lands. These chests contained not only the herbs and simple remedies that any village healer might possess, but also rare substances imported through the complex trade networks that connected medieval Europe to the wider world. Opium from the Eastern Mediterranean for pain relief, exotic spices believed to have medicinal properties, precious stones ground to powder for their supposed therapeutic effects. The examination of Lord Geoffrey's damaged tooth took place not in a cold stone infirmary or a peasant cottage lit by smoky tallow candles, but in the Lord's private solar, a comfortable chamber specifically designed for the Lord's personal use and intimate gatherings. This room represented the pinnacle of medieval domestic comfort, warmed by a large fireplace whose chimney was designed to draw smoke efficiently up and away from the living space. Furnished with cushioned chairs whose upholstery was imported from distant workshops, decorated with Turkish carpets whose intricate patterns spoke of the skill of craftsmen working thousands of miles away. The chamber's windows were fitted with glass, an expensive luxury that most people never experienced, allowing natural light to supplement the artificial illumination while keeping out the winter cold. The walls were hung with fine tapestries and decorated with personal possessions that spoke of wealth, education, and refined taste. Illuminated manuscripts, carved ivory objects, precious metalwork, and paintings executed by skilled artists whose names might be remembered alongside those of their noble patrons. Master Bernard's examination was conducted with instruments that would have seemed impossibly refined to common folks struggling with dental problems. Silver probes for testing the tooth stability and assessing the extent of damage, a small mirror of polished metal for better visibility into the darker recesses of the mouth, and even a primitive form of forceps crafted by skilled metalworkers specifically for dental extractions, their design refined through generations of medical practice and aristocratic patronage. The physician's technique was equally sophisticated, involving not just the physical examination of the damaged tooth, but also a comprehensive assessment of Lord Geoffrey's overall health, his humoral balance, the astrological influences that might affect the timing and success of treatment. Master Bernard consulted elaborate charts that correlated planetary positions with medical procedures, determined the most auspicious time for intervention, and prescribed preparatory treatments designed to optimize the body's natural healing capabilities. When Master Bernard determined that the tooth could not be saved and would require extraction, the procedure was planned and executed with a ceremony and level of care that reflected Lord Geoffrey's social status and the resources at his disposal. The extraction was scheduled for a day when the moon and planets were in favorable alignment. The chamber was prepared with special attention to cleanliness and comfort, and arrangements were made to ensure that the Lord's recovery would proceed under optimal conditions. Lord Geoffrey was seated not on a simple wooden stool or crude bench, but in his favorite chair, a masterpiece of medieval craftsmanship cushioned with silk pillows and positioned near the fire for warmth and optimal lighting. The chair itself was a work of art, its wooden frame carved with intricate designs and reinforced with metal fittings that were both functional and decorative, its very presence in the room speaking to the intersection of utility and beauty that characterized aristocratic life. The pain management available to Lord Geoffrey during his dental extraction represented the pinnacle of medieval medical technology and pharmaceutical knowledge. He was given wine mixed with poppy juice, a powerful painkiller that was far beyond the reach of common people, requiring connections to international trade networks and the financial resources to purchase substances that might cost more than a peasant family's annual income. This preparation was mixed according to carefully calculated proportions designed to provide maximum pain relief while minimizing the risk of dangerous side effects. During the procedure, Lord Geoffrey was attended not only by Master Bernard and his assistant, but also by his personal chaplain, a learned cleric whose presence served multiple purposes, offering prayers for a successful procedure and quick healing, providing spiritual comfort during a moment of physical trial, and serving as a witness to ensure that the medical treatment was conducted according to proper protocols and Christian principles. The extraction itself was performed with tools that had been carefully prepared according to the best medical practices of the time. Heated in the fire to ensure cleanliness, cleaned with wine to remove any impurities, and designed with the precision that skilled metalworkers could achieve when money was no object. Master Bernard's technique, refined through years of experience treating similar cases among the nobility, emphasized speed and precision, minimizing the duration of pain while ensuring complete removal of the damaged tooth structure. But perhaps most significantly, Lord Geoffrey's recovery was supported by resources that transformed the entire experience of tooth loss from a crisis of survival into a manageable inconvenience. While Brother Thomas had learned to subsist on monastery gruel and thin broths, struggling to maintain adequate nutrition while his mouth healed, Lord Geoffrey's kitchen staff immediately began preparing special foods designed to be both nourishing and easy to consume, their efforts guided by Master Bernard's medical knowledge and the Lord's personal preferences. These recovery foods represented a level of culinary sophistication that was simply unimaginable for common folk. Delicate broths made from the finest cuts of meat, carefully seasoned with imported spices and enriched with ingredients chosen for their supposed medicinal properties. Custards sweetened with honey imported from distant apiaries and flavored with exotic substances like cinnamon, nutmeg, and ginger. Soft breads made from the purest flour, enriched with eggs and butter, and baked too. A texture that required minimal chewing while providing maximum nutrition and pleasure. Lord Geoffrey's personal servants were instructed in the preparation of specialized mouth rinses using wine, salt, and aromatic herbs. Their formulations based on medical texts that preserved the wisdom of ancient physicians while incorporating more recent discoveries in the treatment of dental problems. Fresh rushes mixed with healing herbs were laid in his chambers daily to ensure pleasant air and prevent infection, while the Lord's daily routine was completely reorganized around his healing process. Most importantly, Lord Geoffrey was not required to perform physical labor, to speak at length during formal occasions, or to maintain the exhausting schedule of responsibilities that normally filled his days. His duties as Lord of the Manor were temporarily assumed by trusted subordinates. His social obligations were postponed or modified to accommodate his condition, and his entire household was organized around ensuring his comfort and promoting his rapid recovery. The social implications of Lord Geoffrey's tooth loss were also dramatically different from those experienced by common people. Rather than marking him as somehow diminished or less capable, his dental adventure became a topic of courtly conversation, almost a badge of honor that demonstrated his courage in tournament combat and his willingness to risk personal injury in the service of chivalric ideals. The gap where his tooth had been was seen as evidence of his martial prowess, a visible reminder of his participation in the dangerous games that separated aristocratic men from their social inferiors. Several court poets even composed verses comparing his sacrifice to that of warriors in ancient legends, their elaborate metaphors transforming a simple dental problem into an epic tale of heroism and endurance. These poems were performed during evening entertainments, their elegant language and classical allusions serving to elevate the Lord's mundane suffering into something worthy of literary immortalization, while simultaneously demonstrating the poet's skill and the refined cultural atmosphere of the aristocratic household. More practically, Lord Geoffrey's wealth allowed him access to solutions that were simply impossible for common folk to even imagine, let alone afford. Within a few months of losing his tooth, he commissioned a replacement made from walrus ivory, a material so rare and expensive that its very possession marked him as a person of extraordinary wealth and international connections. The ivory itself had traveled thousands of miles from the Arctic regions where walruses were hunted by specialized groups of sailors and traders. Its journey to Lord Geoffrey's castle representing one of the most extensive and expensive trade networks of the medieval world. The replacement tooth was carved by a master craftsman whose skills in working ivory were legendary throughout the region, a man whose workshop produced decorative objects for royalty and whose waiting list included some of the most powerful nobles in Europe. The carving process alone required weeks of careful work, shaping the ivory to match exactly the size and contours of Lord Geoffrey's natural teeth, while the fitting involved multiple appointments to ensure perfect alignment and comfortable function. The tooth was fitted with golden wire, itself a material of considerable value, that was carefully shaped and adjusted to anchor the prosthetic to the adjacent natural teeth. This wire work required the skills of both the ivory carver and a goldsmith, their collaboration producing a piece of medieval dental engineering that was both functional and ornamental, serving as a constant display of the Lord's wealth and access to the finest craftsmen of his age. The completed prosthetic was not only functional but beautiful, its surface polished to a lustrous shine that caught and reflected light, its color carefully matched to blend with Lord Geoffrey's natural teeth, while still being distinctive enough to mark it as something special and valuable. When he smiled or spoke, the replacement tooth served as a conversation piece, a tangible demonstration of his resources and his refusal to accept physical limitations that lesser people might simply endure. Now let us turn our attention to a dramatically different experience of dental loss, one that reveals the harsh realities faced by those at the bottom of medieval society's rigid hierarchy. Contrast Lord Geoffrey's privileged dental adventure with that of Elena, a peasant woman working the same lands that provided the Lord with his wealth and comfort, living in circumstances that would seem almost unimaginably harsh to our modern sensibilities. Elena's dwelling was a single-room cottage constructed from the cheapest materials available, walls of wattle and daub, woven branches covered with a mixture of mud, straw, and animal dung that hardened to provide basic weather protection, topped with a roof of thatch that leaked during heavy rains and required constant maintenance to remain even marginally waterproof. The floor was packed earth, sometimes covered with rushes when they could be gathered, but more often left bare, becoming muddy during wet weather and dusty during dry spells. This single room served as kitchen, bedroom, workshop, and animal shelter for Elena's family. Herself, her husband Thomas, 3 surviving children from the 6 she had borne, 2 pigs whose presence provided both warmth and economic security, and whatever chickens had not yet fallen prey to foxes, disease, or the simple desperation of hungry neighbors during particularly difficult times. The cottage had no chimney, only a hole in the roof above the central hearth, which meant that smoke from cooking fires filled the room before slowly escaping, leaving everything covered with soot and creating the chronic respiratory problems that plague peasant families. Elena's daily routine began before dawn and continued long after sunset, filled with the endless physical labor required to scratch a subsistence, living from soil that was often poor and weather that was frequently hostile. Her work included not only the agricultural tasks that provided food for her family and rent for her lord, planting, weeding, harvesting the strips of land allocated to her household in the village's common fields, but also the countless domestic tasks that sustained daily life in pre-industrial society. She spun thread from wool sheared from sheep that grazed on common lands, wove cloth on a simple loom constructed for what gathered in the Lord's forests, prepared and preserved food for the winter months when fresh provisions would be scarce or unavailable, tended the small garden behind her cottage where she grew vegetables and herbs for her family's use, cared for the animals whose survival was essential to her family's economic security, and maintained the cottage itself against the constant threats of weather, decay, and the simple where that comes from housing both humans and animals in the same small space. When Elena began to experience pain in her lower molar sometime during the harvest season, that crucial time when every able body was desperately needed to bring in the grain before winter weather could destroy the crops that represented survival for the entire community, she had no option but to continue working despite her discomfort. There was no Master Bernard to summon, no comfortable chamber in which to rest, no servants to prepare special foods or mix pain-relieving drafts. The harvest itself was a community effort that required Elena's participation regardless of her personal condition. The grain had to be cut when it was ripe, bound into sheaves while the weather held, transported to the threshing grounds, and processed into flour before the autumn rains could ruin months of careful cultivation. Elena's absence from this crucial work would not only deprive her family of their share of the harvest, but could also result in fines or other penalties from the lord officials, who monitored peasant labor contributions with careful attention to ensuring that feudal obligations were met in full. Elena's treatment options were limited to whatever remedies she could prepare herself or obtain from Margaret, the village wise woman, an elderly peasant who had learned herb lore from her own mother and grandmother in an unbroken chain of traditional knowledge that stretched back through generations of rural women who had faced similar challenges. Margaret's treatments were effective within their severe limitations. Willow bark tea to reduce pain and inflammation, warm poultices of bread and herbs applied to the outside of the face to draw out infection, prayers and charms that provided psychological comfort even if they offered no physical relief. Margaret's cottage, even smaller and more primitive than Elena's, served as the village's informal medical center during times of crisis. Here, peasant women gathered to share remedies and offer mutual support, their conversations creating a repository of practical knowledge about managing pain, treating infection, and adapting to physical limitations. The atmosphere in Margaret's cottage during these informal medical consultations was one of quiet solidarity. Women who understood that they shared not only common challenges, but also the fundamental reality that their survival depended largely on their own resources and the support they could provide each other. The herbs that Margaret used in her treatments were gathered from the wild areas that remained uncultivated, hedgerows, forest margins, and used corners of fields where medicinal plants grew without human cultivation. This gathering required extensive knowledge of plant identification, seasonal timing, and proper preparation techniques, skills that were passed down through generations of women who served as their community's primary medical practitioners. The effectiveness of these treatments, while limited by medieval understanding of anatomy and infection, was often surprisingly good within the context of available resources. But Elena's tooth loss, when it finally occurred during a particularly difficult day of threshing grain, the repetitive motion of beating harvested grain with wooden flails to separate the edible kernels from their husks, brought consequences that would reshape her life in ways that Lord Geoffrey never had to consider. The physical demands of peasant life meant that Elena could not simply avoid foods that were difficult to chew, as the Lord might do by instructing his kitchen staff to prepare softer alternatives. Her family's survival depended on her ability to process whatever food was available, whether that meant gnawing on preserved meat that had been salted and dried to the consistency of leather, grinding coarse grains between her remaining teeth to create flour for bread, or chewing tough root vegetables that had been stored through the winter months in conditions that were far from ideal. The loss of her molar reduced her chewing capacity significantly, making these essential tasks more difficult and time-consuming while offering no alternative methods for accomplishing the work. The loss of Elena's tooth also affected her economic productivity in ways that had immediate consequences for her family's welfare and long-term survival. Much of peasant women's work involved food preparation tasks that required strong, healthy teeth. Cracking nuts gathered from common lands to extract the valuable oils and proteins they contained, chewing grains to soften them for infant feeding when babies were being weaned from mother's milk, processing plant fibers by chewing them to the proper consistency for spinning in a thread. Elena's reduced capacity to perform these tasks meant that they took longer to complete, reducing the time available for other essential work like tending the family's animals, maintaining their cottage, or gathering wild foods that supplemented their basic diet during the lean months before harvest. In a subsistence economy where every hour of productive work was crucial to survival, this reduction in efficiency could mean the difference between adequate nutrition and chronic hunger, between maintaining the family's economic obligations and falling into debt to the lord or neighboring families. Perhaps most significantly, Elena's tooth loss occurred within a social system that offered no safety net for those whose physical capabilities were diminished by injury, illness, or aging. Unlike Lord Geoffrey, whose wealth insulated him from the practical consequences of physical limitations, Elena's reduced capacity to work could threaten her family's ability to meet their feudal obligations, pay their rents, and maintain their position within the village's social and economic hierarchy. The medieval peasants' relationship with their lord was based fundamentally on the exchange of labor and agricultural produce for protection and the right to work specified parcels of land. When illness or injury reduced a peasant family's productivity, they faced the risk of falling behind in their obligations, accumulating debts that could lead to the loss of their land rights, their cottage, and even their freedom. Elena's dental problems, while seemingly minor compared to more dramatic illnesses or injuries, represented a genuine threat to her family's long-term security and social position. Yet even within these harsh constraints, medieval peasant communities developed their own forms of mutual support and adaptation that reveal the fundamental human capacity for compassion and cooperation even under the most difficult circumstances. Elena's neighbors, understanding that her situation could easily become their own fate, found ways to help that didn't threaten their own family's survival or violate the complex web of obligations and relationships that govern village life. During communal food preparation for harvest celebrations, religious festivals, or other community gatherings, other women would quietly take on the tasks that required the strongest teeth, cracking nuts, chewing tough fibers, processing foods that demanded significant jaw strength, while Elena contributed in ways that played to her remaining capabilities. She might take charge of cooking tasks that required skill and experience rather than physical strength, or assume responsibility for supervising children while their mothers performed the more demanding physical work. The village wise woman, Margaret, also served a social function that went far beyond simple medical treatment, her cottage becoming a gathering place for women dealing with similar problems and offering them a space where they could share practical advice about managing daily life with dental limitations. Here, Elena could learn techniques developed by other women who had faced similar challenges. Ways of preparing food that made tough materials more manageable, strategies for eating that maximize nutrition while minimizing stress on remaining teeth, methods for managing pain during particularly difficult periods. This informal network of mutual aid extended to include adaptations in food preparation that benefited the entire community while specifically helping those with dental problems. Techniques developed to make tough foods more palatable for people with missing teeth. Longer cooking times that broke down resistant fibers. Grinding grains more finely to reduce the chewing required. Adding certain herbs that helped soften meat during cooking eventually became standard practices that improved nutrition and eating experiences for everyone. The contrast between noble and peasant experiences of tooth loss extended even to their treatment in death and the afterlife, as revealed in the burial practices that marked the end of their earthly struggles. Lord Geoffrey, when he eventually died some years later from an illness unrelated to his dental problems, was interred in the castle chapel with great ceremony befitting his social status, his body prepared by skilled morticians who understood the techniques needed to preserve the appearance and dignity of noble corpses. His burial involved elaborate rituals that demonstrated both his family's wealth and their understanding of proper aristocratic protocol. His body was dressed in his finest clothing, including silk undergarments and a velvet outer robe decorated with gold thread and precious stones, while his replacement tooth, that masterwork of ivory and gold that had marked his status and ingenuity, was buried with him as a symbol of his earthly achievements and social position. The funeral ceremony itself lasted for days, involving multiple religious services, elaborate meals for visiting nobles and clergy, and charitable distributions to the poor that were designed both to honor the deceased and to demonstrate the family's continued wealth and social responsibility. Professional mourners were hired to ensure that the emotional display was appropriate to Lord Geoffrey's status, while musicians performed compositions specifically commissioned for the occasion. Elena, by contrast, was buried in the village churchyard when her time came, her body wrapped in a simple shroud made from linen that her family had woven themselves, her grave marked only by a wooden cross that would gradually decay and disappear over the following decades. Yet archaeological evidence suggests that her burial, while humble, was conducted with genuine care and respect that spoke to the bonds of community and affection that had sustained her throughout her difficult life. Her body was positioned carefully according to Christian tradition. Her few personal possessions, a simple bronze ring worn smooth by years of hard work, a wooden comb that had been a wedding gift, a small knife that had served countless daily purposes, were placed with her as tokens of love and remembrance. The grave itself was dug by friends and neighbors who had shared her struggles and understood the value of a life lived with dignity despite constant hardship. The records kept by the castle's clerks, those meticulous accountants of medieval life who tracked every aspect of the economic relationships between lord and peasant, provide us with fascinating glimpses into how dental problems affected the broader feudal system and the practical arrangements that governed medieval society. During years when dental problems were particularly widespread among the peasant population, often correlating with periods of poor nutrition, harsh weather, or epidemic diseases that weakened overall health, the records show decreased productivity in certain types of work that required strong, healthy teeth. These productivity decreases led to adjustments in the obligations owed by peasants to their lord, with reductions in expected labor service or rent payments that recognized the practical reality that people with dental problems simply could not perform certain tasks at their previous levels of efficiency. These adjustments reveal a pragmatic understanding that dental health was not merely a personal medical issue, but an economic factor that affected the entire feudal system's ability to function effectively. The records also show that lords who were too rigid in their demands, who failed to account for the realities of dental disease and other health problems among their workers, often found their lands less productive and their revenues reduced compared to neighbors who adopted more flexible approaches. This economic pressure created incentives for lords to take at least some interest in the health and welfare of their peasant workers, leading to occasional investments in community health measures or support for local healers and wise women. Some lords, perhaps learning from these experiences or motivated by religious teachings about Christian charity, began to take a more active interest in the dental health of their peasants, seeing it as an investment in their own economic well-being. The records of certain estates show payments made to traveling healers who were hired to treat dental problems among the peasant population, arrangements that were motivated not by altruism, but by the practical understanding that healthy workers were more productive workers, and that preventing dental problems was often less expensive than dealing with their economic consequences. This economic approach to dental health created interesting contradictions and tensions within medieval society. While social hierarchy meant that lords and peasants lived vastly different lives in almost every respect. Their dental health was ultimately interconnected through the economic relationships that bound them together in the feudal system. A lord whose peasants suffered from widespread dental problems might find his own wealth and comfort threatened by reduced agricultural productivity, while peasants whose lord invested in their health might find their lives marginally improved by access to better medical care. These interconnections sometimes led to cooperative efforts that crossed normal social boundaries. Lords providing access to expensive imported medicines for peasant communities during dental health crises, peasants sharing traditional remedies and treatment techniques with castle households, wise women being consulted by noble families when conventional medical approaches proved inadequate. Such collaborations were always temporary and limited, never challenging the fundamental power structures of medieval society. But they demonstrate the ways that shared human vulnerability could sometimes create unexpected alliances and mutual assistance. Yet we must not romanticize these relationships or imagine that economic interdependence created genuine equality or social justice. The gap between Lord Geoffrey's ivory tooth and Elena's silent endurance remained vast and unbridgeable, reflecting power structures that determined not just access to dental care, but the fundamental experience of being human in the medieval world. Elena's dental problems were always her family's private crisis, managed through their own resources and the limited support available within peasant communities, while Lord Geoffrey's similar problems became opportunities to display wealth, access to expertise, and the social support that privilege could command. The medieval experience of dental loss, thus, serves as a microcosm of broader patterns of privilege and vulnerability that have shaped human societies throughout history, reminding us that even the most basic aspects of physical existence, the ability to eat without pain, to speak clearly, to smile without shame, have always been influenced by the accidents of birth, wealth, and social position that continue to shape human experience in our own time. As we consider these contrasts between medieval noble and peasant experiences of tooth loss, we might reflect on how they echo through the centuries to our contemporary world. While modern dentistry has dramatically reduced the suffering associated with dental problems, and while our social safety nets provide more support for those facing medical challenges than medieval peasants could have imagined, the fundamental relationship between wealth and health remains complex and often troubling. The medieval experience reminds us that dental health, the most basic aspect of daily comfort and function, has always been intertwined with larger questions of social justice, economic opportunity, and human dignity. Lord Geoffrey's replacement tooth and Elena's silent adaptation represent different responses to the same fundamental human vulnerability. Responses shaped by circumstances largely beyond their individual control, but reflecting social systems that could have been organized differently, more fairly, with greater attention to the basic needs and dignity of all people regardless of their social position. In the quiet hours before dawn, as both lord and peasant might have run their tongues over their teeth in that same ancient ritual of self-assessment we explored at the beginning of our journey, the fundamental difference was not in their human vulnerability to dental problems. Disease and decay affected noble and peasant alike, but in their access to resources, support, and alternatives when problems arose. Lord Geoffrey could face the future with confidence in his ability to command the best care his world could provide, while Elena's assessment carried the weight of knowing that her body's reliability was essential not just to her own survival, but to that of everyone who depended on her labor and care. These contrasts in medieval dental experience offer us a window into the broader patterns of privilege and vulnerability that have shaped human societies throughout recorded history. They remind us that even the most intimate and apparently individual aspects of physical existence, the health of the teeth in our mouths, the pain we feel when we bite down wrong, the confidence we have in our ability to eat and speak normally, have always been influenced by the social, economic, and political systems within which we live our lives. As we prepare to conclude our gentle journey through the medieval world of dental loss and adaptation, let us carry with us an appreciation for both the extraordinary resilience of people like Elena, who found ways to thrive despite limited resources and minimal support, and a sobering reminder that systems of privilege and inequality have always shaped even the most basic aspects of human experience, including something as personal and immediate as the sensation of biting into an apple without fear, the pleasure of speaking clearly without impediment, or the simple confidence that comes from being able to smile openly without shame or self-consciousness. As the first light of dawn begins to touch the edges of our modern world, we find ourselves returning from our long journey through the medieval landscape of dental experience, our minds enriched by the stories we have encountered and our understanding deepened by the lives we have briefly inhabited. The world of Brother Thomas and Elena, of Lord Geoffrey and the nameless woman whose skull speaks to us across centuries, begins to fade like a dream upon waking. But the wisdom contained in their experiences remains with us, a quiet reminder of both how far we have traveled and how much we share with those who walked these paths before us. Throughout our exploration, we have seen that the loss of a tooth in the Middle Ages was never simply a medical event, never merely a problem to be solved or endured in isolation. Instead, it was always a deeply human experience that touched every aspect of life. The practical challenges of eating and speaking, the social implications of changed appearance and function, the economic consequences of reduced productivity, the spiritual questions raised by physical suffering, and the profound adaptations required when the body we depend upon changes in ways that cannot be reversed. We have witnessed the remarkable resilience of the human spirit in the face of challenges that our modern world has largely forgotten. The ingenuity that allowed medieval people to develop new ways of living when old ways were no longer possible, and the compassion that led communities to support members who faced difficulties that could strike anyone at any time. In Brother Thomas's months of suffering transformed into spiritual insight, in Elena's quiet adaptation to physical limitation, in the archaeological evidence of communities caring for those who could no longer care for themselves, we find testimony to the enduring capacity of human beings to find meaning, dignity, and purpose even under the most challenging circumstances. Yet we have also been reminded of the harsh realities of privilege and power that shaped medieval society, the ways that social position could transform the same basic human experience into vastly different stories of suffering or comfort, limitation or opportunity. The contrast between Lord Geoffrey's ivory replacement tooth and Elena's silent endurance speaks to truths about inequality and access to resources that remain painfully relevant in our own time, even as the specific forms of dental care and social organization have changed beyond medieval recognition. As you settle deeper into sleep, let these medieval voices fade gently into the background of your consciousness, their stories joining the vast library of human experience.